Bad, not bad. We have our infinite scroll in place. So now, of course, we can focus on our form. So what I would want is to add some kind of search term. And then once we click on submit, we're fetching images that, of course, reflect that search term. And I think we're going to start with API documentation, where we go with search. Notice here we have search photos. And then again, the URL is going to be a bit different, where instead of the endpoint, the root endpoint, and then plus photos, between them we place search. And then, of course, we're going to have query of what we are searching. So we go with search photos and then question mark, of course, and then we go with query. But for the query, of course, we would want to pass in that search term. And yes, we'll also use the pages, and you'll see in a second why. So that should be the general setup. Now, of course, I'm going to navigate back to my document. And first, I would want to set up that state value for the form. And that is going to be my query. So we need to understand that, of course, we have the input, and then I'm going to be getting the value from the input, and I'll append to my URL. Because notice, I have this specific URL for the search, and then I just need to add question mark, and then remember the parameter name was query, and I'll set it equal to whatever I'm typing in the input. So for now, I'll just remove it since we'll set up a separate variable for that. But we're going to go with const and then query. So query, and then remember set query, and that one is equal to use state, and then it's just going to be an empty string. Then, of course, we need to navigate to our form. And remember, we need to add two things. We needed to set up our value so we can always show our state value. And second one is on change. And of course, why we're doing that, because we would want to have the controlled input. So value will be equal to my state value of query, and on change is going to be equal to my arrow function. I'll pass in the object since I would want to get the value from the input. So we go with set query, and there we pass event, target, and then also value. So as we're typing something in input, of course, we're changing the state value. And we can always double check that if we navigate to the bigger browser. And I'm going to go with components. And if everything is set up correctly, then notice I have the state value of the query that is reflecting exactly what I'm typing in the input. And that is an awesome, awesome start. Then we would want to go back to our project. And what we're looking for is this fetch function, because we need to understand that in the fetch, of course, we'll have to change a little bit our URL, because we have one URL where we're just getting a list of photos. So that's going to be our default setup. But then there's going to be another one when actually the user types something in the search. So inside of the fetch images function, what I would want to do is set up another variable. So I have one for the page. Now set up one for the query. So I'm going to say const, and then the value will be URL, and then query. And again, I'll use my template literal. Again, I'm going to use the add, because that's how we add these URL parameters. And we're going to go with query is equal, and then my state value. And of course, I'll pass in the query. And here's the big thing. I only would want to use this URL if there's nothing in the query. So if there's something already in the input, of course, I would want to use this URL, the search URL. However, if there's nothing there, then of course, I would just want to use my default setup. So instead of just setting up URL to be this one value, I would want to check, hey, listen, if there's something in the query. So essentially, if the query is empty string, then I'll use my default setup, my URL. However, if there's something already in a query, then of course I'll construct that URL a bit different. So say if query, so if there's something there, then of course the URL is going to be equal to a new value. So I'll have my template string. I'm going to have to use this search URL instead. So let's access that value. So we go with search URL. then we still need to add that client ID. And that's the reason why we set up everything in the variables. So we go with client ID. Then I also have page, because pages will be changing, since I also would want to set up the functionality when the user searches for the cat. I also would want to display multiple pages. That's why I'll pass in the variable of URL page, this one over here. And by the way, I just noticed that I have big fat typo actually there. My apologies. We go with URL page and now URL page here as well. Make sure that you change that, because otherwise I had it the opposite way. And then lastly, I'll pass in that query. So the query variable that holds the value of my query and the parameter. So set it up over here. And by the way, I have too many $signs here. And we'll pass in the URL and then query. So that is our URL if there's some query. However, if there's no query, then we just go with our basic setup, the one that we already had. Main URL, client ID, and then the URL page. Okay, that's good. But there's going to be another gotcha. And that another gotcha is that when we'll get back data when we have the query. So when we're searching, the actual data is going to be in a different place. So before we do anything, let's just go with console log, like so. And then let's take a look at the data. And in order not to get a big fat error, I'm just going to comment this out for a second, and then eventually we'll set this up. Moment we don't have any images, but we should be able to type here, hello, and of course we can fetch images. Now the problem is going to be that, of course, we don't have the handle submit. That's something that we would still need to set up. So at the moment I have the hello. By the way, we'll see whether we're getting anything as far as photos that reflect hello. And then in the handle submit function we created all the way in the beginning, now I would want to fetch images. So I will invoke this function. So I invoke it, and of course, now I wiped out my hello anyway. So let me go with cat and let's submit that. So we have loading and I get some kind of data. Now, what I'm trying to show you that in a console, we're going to have the data, but that is our initial fetch. So if we'll add some kind of value here, you'll notice that the response is a bit different. So by default, we get these 10 values, correct? But then when we're searching, notice how our array is actually sitting in the object and the property is the results. And the reason why I comment everything out in our fetch images function is because, of course, we'll get a big fat error because I'm spreading out the data, which is going to be an object. So now, of course, we'll have to be a bit more vigilant of what we're actually getting back. And in here, let's just start by if query. So if it exists, then of course my data is in a different place. My photos essentially are in a different place. So in here, we'll say return, and then I would still want to spread out all photos, then comma, and now I would want to spread out data and then dot results. Why? Well, because we can see that if we just get default images, then of course we just get the data. We just have the array of images. And if we're searching, so if there's a search query, then of course we're getting back the object. That's why we go with object, and then we're looking for results. If, however, this is still default, we still have the functionality of else, and then we're returning from this function old photos, and then comma, and then we spread out the data. So if we have default images, this doesn't change. Please keep that in mind. If, however, we're searching, then of course this value also changes.